grande piacere che do il benvenuto a tutti i presenti al convegno La traduzione come atto politico, questa magnifica cornice della sala dei notari che il Comune di Perugia, la Presidenza del Consiglio Comunale ci ha generosamente messo a disposizione. Do il benvenuto anche a nome dei colleghi Federico Zanettin e Diana Bianchi che hanno organizzato insieme a me il convegno, e anche a nome dei colleghi dell'Università di Manchester, dell'equipe del gruppo The Genealogies of Knowledge Project, Ian Butts e Harry Jones. We would like to welcome all of you here in the Sala dei Notari, former Council Hall and site of intense political debate, to the conference Translation as Political Act, organized by the Università di Perugia in collaboration with the Genealogies of Knowledge Project at the University of Manchester. Bonjour à toutes, à tous. C'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que nous vous accueillons ici à notre colloque La traduction comme acte politique, organisé par l'Università di Perugia en collaboration avec l'équipe Genealogies of Knowledge Project de l'Université de Manchester. Je suis particulièrement heureuse de vous souhaiter la bienvenue aujourd'hui dans cette salle qui fut à l'origine un lieu d'échange et de débat politique. Soyez donc les bienvenus et j'espère que vous apprécierez ces 3 jours d'échange et de partage. Prima di introdurre le autorità che hanno accettato di portare i loro saluti e che ringrazio per la loro presenza qui oggi, ci tengo a sottolineare che siamo particolarmente lieti e anche emozionati di avervi qui con noi per giornate come queste dedicate alla ricerca, allo scambio e alla discussione sulla funzione e sui meccanismi del tradurre nell'agire politico, declinati secondo tematiche che riteniamo di particolare attualità e di interesse. Sono qui da voi rappresentate molte lingue e culture, molte più di quelle che saranno ufficialmente utilizzate durante le comunicazioni del convegno, cioè l'italiano, l'inglese e il francese, e dato che questa conferenza tematizza il ruolo della traduzione, riteniamo che tutti i partecipanti saranno in grado di interagire in almeno 2 di queste lingue e che il lavoro quindi di traduzione che inevitabilmente ne conseguirà sarà già in qualche modo di per sé un risultato. Auguro dunque a tutti di cuore buon lavoro e vi ringrazio. Vorrei portare anzi, prima di passare la parola ai colleghi, i saluti del Rettore che purtroppo non è potuto essere qui con noi ma che ci manda oggi i suoi saluti. Passerei la parola quindi alla professoressa Alessandra Pioggia del Dipartimento di Scienze Politiche, nonché direttrice dell'EPA, Centro di Studi Alta Formazione Legality and Participation, costituito nell'ambito del nostro Dipartimento di Scienze Politiche che promuove il convegno e cuore del progetto di eccellenza del Dipartimento di Scienze Politiche. E la ringrazio.
Grazie anche da parte mia, Francesca, e prima di portarvi i saluti in qualità di direttrice del Centro Studi Legalità e Partecipazione, ci tengo a portare a tutti voi il saluto del direttore del Dipartimento di Scienze Politiche, il professor Ambrogio Sant'Ambrogio, che questa mattina per motivi istituzionali non può essere presente, ma che ci ha pregato di portare a tutti voi il saluto del Dipartimento. Personalmente sono felice ed emozionata di avere l'occasione di dare il benvenuto a così tanti colleghi provenienti da paesi diversi e presenti qui oggi per questa iniziativa. Il Centro Studi Legalità e Partecipazione del Dipartimento di Scienze Politiche che ospita questo evento ha posto al centro della ricerca interdisciplinare proprio i temi della legalità, nella consapevolezza che questa sia strumento di costituzione di una società più giusta e della partecipazione, che consente a tutte le componenti della società di essere protagoniste di questo progetto. Nel quadro di una realtà e società in profonda trasformazione come la nostra, credo che l'aver scelto il tema della traduzione come atto politico e averlo posto al centro di queste giornate di studio sia stata una decisione particolarmente felice, perché mette l'accento da un lato su uno strumento importantissimo di partecipazione, qual è il dibattito e lo scambio di idee e di pensieri nella società e anche nella politica, per la quale è fondamentale lo strumento della traduzione, ma consente di porre l'accento anche su un'altra dimensione importante della legalità questa volta, quella del diritto come sistema, anche come sistema di linguaggio. Per questo sono particolarmente felice di poter dare a voi il benvenuto e farvi l'augurio di un buon e fruttuoso lavoro in queste giornate. Grazie.
Grazie alla professoressa Pioggia. Darei la parola al dottor Leonardo Marasano, Presidente del Consiglio Comunale della città di Perugia, per un suo saluto. Grazie.
Grazie, buongiorno. Porgo a tutti voi con piacere il saluto e il benvenuto dell'amministrazione comunale insieme all'assessore alla cultura Teresa Severini. Siamo lieti di ospitarvi in questa sala, nello scrigno del nostro palazzo comunale. Permettetemi un ringraziamento a tutti gli organizzatori, alla professoressa Pioggia, al professor Zanettin, alla professoressa Bianchi e alla professoressa Piselli. Per noi è, dicevo, un piacere, siamo in una fase di transizione, eppure abbiamo voluto tenere fede a questo impegno preso ormai qualche mese fa. Perché? Perché crediamo in due aspetti innanzitutto nella collaborazione tra enti, l'ente comune e l'ente università, e credo che questo appuntamento così rilevante celebrato in questa sala sia, come dire, la conferma di questa collaborazione proficua. Poi ci piace sottolineare la vocazione della nostra città, che è evidentemente una vocazione agli studi ed è evidentemente una vocazione internazionale. Oggi, mentre in questa sala si celebra il convegno sulla traduzione politica, nell'altra sala, nella sala del Consiglio Comunale, celebriamo il 41esimo convegno di americanistica, dove si incontrano anche lì culture e studiosi provenienti da varie parti del mondo. Ecco, ci tenevamo a dare il nostro supporto, ringrazio la Facoltà di Scienze Politiche, ringrazio tutti voi intervenuti e vi auguro buon lavoro.
Molte grazie. Passo la parola all'assessore Teresa Severini per un suo saluto.
Eh bien, bonjour, c'est mon tour que c'est un plaisir, je vous dis, c'est un plaisir de vous accueillir ici à Perugia. On a tout dit en effet, mais ce que je voulais souligner, c'est en étant l'assesseur à la culture, tourisme et l'université, c'est vraiment que c'est un anneau de conjonction entre différentes cultures qui se trouvent très bien organisées ici à Perugia, une ville internationale et interculturelle, si je peux dire, où de différentes universités, l'université des études italiennes bien sûr, mais aussi l'université pour les étrangers et des autres instituts d'autres formations, ont le droit de parler de culture et d'interculture à des étudiants qui viennent de différents pays. Et donc, l'importance de la traduction, au mieux, on pourrait bien dire l'acte de traduire plutôt que la traduction, c'est très important comme thème et on est vraiment content d'entendre ce qu'on va étudier ce jour de congrès. It's of course a great pleasure as being the Deputy Mayor for Culture, Tourism and University to welcome also in your language, les différents langages naturellement, to welcome you And congratulations to the organizers for having choose to do this in Perugia, in this room where history is talking also, and without the duty of translation, because you can see all these frescoes in this historical room talking about what Perugia is. Je voudrais aussi vous dire que c'est une ville qui a des trésors d'art très importants, et j'espère que vous aurez le temps de visiter les musées qui sont très importants ici à Perugia, et comme les fresques qu'on voit ici dans ce palais historique parlent d'une culture et d'une histoire qui n'a pas besoin d'être traduite. Thank you very much for being here and welcoming again from the administration of Perugia.
Grazie all'assessore Severini. Do volentieri la parola alla professoressa Caterina Fallo, vicepresidente del DORIF, che ci porta i suoi saluti a nome appunto del DORIF. Grazie.
Anche da parte mia, buongiorno a tutte e a tutti. Siccome non voglio portar via troppo tempo, ho preparato una diapositiva con quello che dirò in francese e in inglese. You can read what I'm going to say on the screen for those who speak English. Je vais dire exactement ce que vous pouvez lire à l'écran en français. Il DORIF è, intanto a nome mio personale, in qualità di vicepresidente, a nome della presidente Micaela Rossi del DORIF, sono lieta di portare a tutti il saluto della nostra associazione. Il DORIF è un'associazione di francesisti che ha lo scopo di promuovere la ricerca e la didattica sulla lingua francese. Il DORIF è fondamentalmente organizzato in gruppi di ricerca e ognuno si dedica a delle tematiche specifiche. Si va dallo studio della grammatica alla traduzione, legato al convegno, all'analisi del discorso, all'analisi dell'interazione, dell'oralità, e potete vedere sul sito tutti i gruppi di ricerca che sono stati costituiti fino adesso. Il DORIF partecipa insieme alle altre associazioni di stranieristica ai dibattiti, agli incontri con le istanze istituzionali e promuove e appoggia le iniziative come quella odierna, come il convegno che si apre oggi, al quale il DORIF ha anche contribuito nelle proprie possibilità, e al quale partecipano comunque dei membri dell'associazione stessa. Io vorrei complimentarmi con gli organizzatori e ringraziarli ovviamente per aver scelto questa tematica, un tema, come hanno detto anche coloro che mi hanno preceduto, che ritengo di estrema attualità e che pone il tradurre come stimolo per la circolazione delle idee, del pensiero, ma anche come stimolo per il nascere di nuove idee e nuovo pensiero. E questo appunto ci fa vedere come la traduzione tocca fondamentalmente qualcosa di molto sensibile, degli ambiti molto sensibili della nostra vita comune, e il programma lo attesta senza ombra di dubbio. La nostra vita dunque all'interno della società, non è dire all'interno della polis. Auguro a tutte e a tutti buon lavoro.
Grazie, ringrazio ancora una volta il DORIF per il patrocinio che ha concesso al nostro convegno. Passo la parola al professor Federico Zanettin, che porta i saluti del professor Antonio Lavieri, presidente della SIT, cioè Società Italiana di Traduzione, che non è potuto essere qui oggi con noi, ma che appunto ci ha mandato un suo breve saluto. Grazie.
leggerò il messaggio che ci ha inviato il professor Antonio Lavieri, che è impegnato ad Oxford al momento, ma non può essere presente, ci ha inviato questo messaggio appunto. Desidero innanzitutto porgere un caro saluto di benvenuto a tutti i presenti, agli organizzatori del convegno, Francesco Piselli, Diana Bianchi, Ian Booth, Harry Jones e Federico Clementini, e all'Università di Perugia, e mi rammarico di non poter essere fra di voi. La traduzione come atto politico, il convegno internazionale che vi vedrà impegnati per i prossimi 3 giorni, riveste una grande importanza, non solo perché rappresenta un'occasione rilevante per ricordare e confermare quanto la traduzione e i processi traduttivi siano centrali per la comprensione della complessa realtà di cui facciamo parte e l'interazione con i contesti linguistici, simbolici e culturali che ci circondano, ma soprattutto perché nel confronto di paradigmi spesso teoricamente incompatibili, eppur sempre adattati, modificati e tradotti, la traduzione, lungi dall'essere una mera tecnica linguistica, si designa come la strategia di fondo che regola la nostra vita culturale e sociale. Che si tratti di traduzione letteraria, istituzionale, economico-scientifica, la traduzione agisce sempre su diversi attori che costituiscono una comunità o una società, contribuendo a proporre, produrre, riprodurre, creare, veicolare e manipolare credenze, conoscenze, idee e valori. Nella veste di Presidente della Società Italiana di Politica, colgo l'occasione per ricordare ai presenti che lo scopo della SIT è quello di raggruppare gli specialisti della storia, delle teorie e delle pratiche traduttive ai fini di assicurare la promozione e lo sviluppo degli studi traduttologici in Italia. La società opera inoltre per la visibilità degli studi traduttologici di tradizione italiana in ambito scientifico internazionale. Ma il suo obiettivo è anche quello di riunire intorno alla traduzione una comunità di studiosi provenienti da vari ambiti scientifico-disciplinari, non soltanto attraverso le loro attività di insegnamento e di ricerca, ma anche con la vita di donne e uomini, con le loro idee, le loro azioni e le loro emozioni, in una solidarietà sempre rinnovata tra etica, poetica, politica e retorica. Nel rinnovare complimenti a tutto il comitato organizzativo e a tutti coloro che hanno contribuito alla realizzazione di questo importante momento di riflessione e di confronto, concludo formulando dall'Inghilterra, in una ideale cartografia immaginaria e sulle vie della traduzione vicino a Oxford, alla Perugia di Ignazio Danti, i più sinceri auguri di buon inizio e di buon proseguimento dei lavori agli autorevoli colleghi. Antonio Lavieri.
Professoressa Diana Bianchi. Grazie, buongiorno a tutti e un caloroso benvenuto anche da parte mia. Io ho il compito di darvi alcune informazioni di tipo organizzativo in inglese. Before we start with the first talk of today, here is some organizational information. There have been some slight changes to the program, which are not in the printed version that you have in your conference folder, because they happened after the program went into print. These changes are due to colleagues who would have liked to be here today, but they couldn't attend for a number of reasons, and some of these very serious. For example, there is a colleague from Sri Lanka who couldn't come because of what happened in her country, and we will try to establish a Skype connection later if we manage, so we'll see. Anyway, we will inform you of these changes on a day-to-day basis, but you can also check the online version, which has been regularly updated with these changes. I can also anticipate that on Saturday there will be 2 sessions instead of 3, and that they will both finish half an hour earlier. So we'll finish a bit earlier on Saturday.
after the talk by Professor Mona Baker, we will have a coffee break in the next room, which is through that door. There? Yeah. And after the break, at 11:30, we will walk down to the department's main building, where the rest of the conference will take place. It's about a 15-minute walk, and so please follow us and don't get lost in the narrow streets of Perugia. Last but not least, we noticed that there are still some folders that have to be taken, so please, the delegates who have not taken the folders, just go and get them. Thank you very much.
Va bene, a questo punto auguro a tutti buon lavoro, vi ringrazio e passo la parola al professor Zanettin per la prima sessione plenaria. Grazie ancora.
So my task here, my pleasure, is now to introduce our first speaker, who is of course one of those cases for whom the statement that she does not need an introduction would be a proper introduction. But nonetheless, I will say a few words of presentation, since I suspect that some people here may know her for different reasons. Professor Mona Baker is a Professor Emerita of Translation Studies, the Center for Translation and Intercultural Studies of the University of Manchester, and Principal Investigator of the Genealogies of Knowledge Project at the same university, which together with the Department of Political Sciences of this university, Perugia, organized this conference. Professor Baker has also generously agreed to help us make up for some last-minute amendments, of which you just heard from my colleague, and to offer an introductory talk on the panel entitled to the project today. After retirement, she has traveled the Silk Road to Shanghai to also become director of the Baker Center for Translation and Intercultural Studies of the Jiaotong University in Shanghai. And some people in the audience may know her primarily as the author of In Other Words, which is one of the most widely used course books in translation around the world, and whose second edition has just received an award, by the way, as Best Revised Outlet Textbook. Some other people may know her as the editor of the first Encyclopedia of Translation Studies, a third edition of which is also now in print. But some may know her primarily for introducing corpus linguistics to translation studies, as well as translation to corpus linguistics, with a series of articles which are part of the founding literature. But given the theme of the conference and the title of her talk, certainly many people here will think of her primarily as the author of Translation and Conflict, and for introducing narrative theory to translation studies. Professor Baker is, however, well known not only to scholars in translation studies, but also in the social sciences more in general, having published not only in translation studies and linguistics, but also in pragmatics, semiotics, and terrorism studies, among others. Her articles have appeared in a wide range of leading international journals, such as Social Movement Studies, Critical Studies of Terrorism, and she's the editor, among others, of Translating Dissent, Voices from with the Egyptian Revolution, and co-editor of the Routledge Encyclopedia of Citizen Media. What else should I mention? She was the founding editor of the leading translation studies journal Translator, former editorial director of Central Publishing, and founding vice president of IATIS, which is the International Association of Translation and Intercultural Studies. And she's also a prominent and influential intellectual and activist, and posts on translation, citizen media, Egypt and Palestine on her personal website and on Twitter. But I will stop here, will take no more of her and your time, and just announce the title of her plenary lecture, The is the politics of aspirational translation and the temporal dynamics of narration. So she will talk for about 45-50 minutes, I believe, so there should be some time left for a few questions afterwards.
Okay.
Can you put the
Thank you very much, Federico. He had promised he wouldn't give me a long introduction, so that's his idea of a short introduction. Thank you very much. Okay, so the title of my presentation, according to what you would find in your booklet and the abstract that goes with it, has changed because I was asked for these details some months ago, and of course, as you begin to prepare for a talk much later, things change. So I would like, if I may, to replace it with a different title, although it's not a million miles away, and the new title is Activist Strategies in the Century with No Future. I take the expression the century with no future from the book by Franco Berardi, After the Future, to which I will be making reference throughout. But I'll start with a basic assumption in many versions of narrative theory that I have been working with for some years, although I won't really be talking about narrative theory today, but it's a basic assumption which provides a starting point. And the assumption is that everything we experience is mediated, including very concrete aspects of our lives like time and space. I'll be concentrating on time and the implications of this statement for activist translation, and I will be making specific reference to two broad strategies or orientations, prefiguration and aspirational translation. I'll talk a bit more about that later. But prefiguration, as I suspect many people attending this conference will know, is a broad activist strategy often associated with anarchism, which is based on the idea of adopting measures in the here and now, in the present, that prefigure the future and that can bring the desired future, what we think the future should be like, into being. These measures are generally talked about in organizational and structural terms. So people who talk about prefiguration in social movement studies talk about it in the sense of, for example, adopting horizontal, non-hierarchical modes of working together in order to create that horizontal, non-hierarchical future that we all want right now, rather than wait for some point in the future when we can bring it to being. Those who write on prefiguration have, to my knowledge, never written about it from the perspective of textual or semiotic strategies. So they have no interest in language or translation, but I have discussed potential prefigurative strategies of translation in the context of the Egyptian Revolution in a paper that I published in the Translator in 2016, and in a number of papers more generally in terms of the global movements of action and the use of linguistic and translational strategies in a number of other journal articles and book chapters. But apart from textual and semiotic issues, which are generally of no interest to people who work on prefiguration, there is a huge literature on prefiguration in social movement studies, and it has received many complementary definitions and critiques. Aspirational translation, on the other hand, is a concept that awaits a definition, if you like. It's discussed without being defined as such in only one paper by Sherif Gabel, who is a member of the Serene Collective of filmmakers who were very active during the Egyptian Revolution and whom I got to interview for a different project and worked with on a number Sherif Gaber's article, in which he mentions aspirational translation, appeared in a collection that I edited in 2016. The title was Translating Dissent. That's the title of the collection, not the paper. And the collection featured contributions by many activists involved in the Egyptian revolution. Sherif is one of them. He is a researcher and urban planner who, as far as I know, has never written on translation before or since. But anyway, we'll leave it at this, and I'll come back to these strategies of prefiguration and aspirational translation after talking about time and how we orient ourselves to time, because the way we orient ourselves to time has implications for both prefiguration and aspirational translation. So, time is concrete. We can objectively measure units of time, like seconds, minutes, hours, months, years, and so on. But even this objectivity is mediated because obviously our experience of concrete time is mediated by instruments like calendars and diaries and clocks, otherwise we wouldn't have a shared experience of time. Although it is a concrete phenomenon that can be measured objectively, time and the passage of time are also experienced and interpreted subjectively. And this becomes particularly obvious during times of crisis and when people talk about how they interpret momentous events and what they make of them. I recently interviewed two filmmakers in Cairo at their request, Philip Riz and Basma Al-Sharif, for an exhibition of Basma's work which was held at the Camden Arts Centre in London. The interview was about a new project that Basma and Philip are launching from Cairo, but which will take place in various places. The project is called This World is Strange, and it involves them running workshops at different places to produce collective critical translations into Arabic of radical films and other radical written material. Now, Philip and Basma are both based in Cairo, and as most people know, or I hope that people know, that this is a very difficult time in Egypt, where many people are experiencing the post-revolution period as depressive, debilitating even, and where the current regime allows very little space for any form of initiative, including cultural and educational initiatives. During the interview that I did with Basma and Philip, I was struck by how Basma, who is originally a Palestinian from Gaza, justified starting a new radical cultural project in Cairo at this particular moment in time. Most people would think that this is not a particularly productive idea, but she had a justification for it, and I quote her. She says, the moment just after attacks end are hardest. It is harder than war itself. There is something reassuring about survival, about adrenaline, about knowing that the entire world is watching what is happening to you in the midst of a disaster. That the moment that disaster has ended or calmed down and there's only rubble left to pick up and damages to be assessed, that is a far less sexy moment to be a part of. I remember seeing all the journalists leave Gaza and how clear it was that the spotlight was going to shift to the next disaster, the next headline, and recognizing a kind of heavy weight in those who would have to remain to pick up the pieces. Cairo seems to be in a similar state right now. And rather than understanding it as a lull, a depression one could very easily sink into and indulge in, it feels like an important moment when work should be done. So what one makes of a temporal moment or any dimension of time and how one reacts to it is never a given because it is subjective. What one person sees as a debilitating moment, another sees as a moment full of potential and one that demands action rather than despair and passivity. The subjective experience of time also relates to how we orient ourselves towards larger spans of time, like the past, the present, and the future, specifically, these three spans of time. And this has implications for political as well as translational strategies, as I will try to explain. And it's not just in terms of how we individually orient ourselves to the past, present, and the future, but also how we collectively orient ourselves to these spans of time as generations, if you like. That doesn't mean that we all, every single one of them, orient ourselves to the past, present, and future in exactly the same way within a generation. There are always variations, but there's also kind of trends that you can identify across generations. So in an article on human geography and how liberal democracies damage the environment through anticipatory actions, such as bombing Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya to prevent some perceived future threat or political threat of terrorism, for instance, or culling bird populations to prepare for a future attack of avian flu, Anderson reminds us that the future as an imminent, transcendent end of the world was central to the authority of monotheism. The future as indefinite, open, and perfectible enabled accounts of progress, and the future as a mystery underpins forms of iconoclastic utopianism. Each of these orientations, and obviously they are not the only orientations, these are just examples, concerns how the future relates to the past and to the present. Now, how activists and activist translators see the present and foresee the future also has implications for the strategies that they adopt. I'll go back to the same interview that I did with Basma and Philip, and in that interview we discussed why they think it's necessary that the translations that they produce of the, including subtitling of radical films and written material, that they produce through the workshops should be in spoken dialects of Arabic rather than in modern standard Arabic, which is the default choice. Modern standard Arabic is the only Arabic essentially that is allowed for use in subtitling films, and the form of Arabic that is used in practically all written material. Philip's explanation makes sense in terms of the huge disjuncture between the current realities of the region and the historical unfolding of the relationship between modern standard Arabic and the now defunct project of Pan-Arabism and Arab unity. One important aspect of which is the need for all Arabs to adopt a common language. So what unites Arabs, most people would argue, is the ability to all access this modern standard Arabic, which is the form of Arabic that they will share. So Philip says, within the paradigm of a pan-Arabist imagined community, one could say that the latest colonizer in our midst would aim to sever the sense of community among Arabs by restricting their access to a shared language. Today, this logic has lost all meaning, given that Arab states are busy backstabbing each other and the myth of pan-Arabness has long been laid bare. So adopting the spoken dialect of wherever they are holding the workshops, whether it's in Jordan or in Algeria, and subtitling films in that dialect is justified on the basis that rather than tearing nations apart, adopting different dialects merely reflects the current realities of the region, where the Pan-Arab project is dead and where people do speak different dialects and always have done so. In this sense, vernacular translations, Philip says, can address solidarity regionally because they can support currents of solidarity that are not enabled by dominant practices in subtitling and translation in the region. This argument, I would say, reflects a particular orientation towards the past, the present, and the future that I will also try to flesh out through other examples in what follows. But basically, it reflects the feeling that the past is in the past, the future is extremely uncertain, we have no confidence in how it's going to unfold, and the weight of the present is such that we have to respond to it as it is and do our best to cope and effect what changes we can based on current realities, not based on some kind of utopia that we hope or think we can bring into being. This is the core difference I see between prefiguration and aspirational translation, and I will try to flesh that out in more detail. But before I do that, it's important to acknowledge that neither strategy is perfect. So in trying to tease out these differences, I'm not advocating one strategy rather than another. I'm merely saying that different strategies that we believe in at any moment in time reflect our orientations to these kind of big slices of time, the past, present, and future. All activist strategies raise all sorts of tensions and contradictions, and there is no escape from such tensions. And these tensions and contradictions are inescapable, particularly in a fraught political environment. So in the case of adopting spoken dialects for subtitling and possibly even translating radical written material into spoken Arabic, which is practically unheard of, this would arguably empower local communities and reflects the current fragmentation that characterizes the region. It also avoids pretending that there is still an Arab community as such. So you could say it's more honest in this respect. But arguably, it doesn't make the project of connecting communities of struggle across the region any easier, not necessarily at least, because it's very difficult for an Egyptian, for instance, to follow subtitles written in Moroccan Arabic or vice versa, or Yemeni Arabic. And there's also the issue of literacy. So you could argue, well, subtitles have to be read, and if you can read and write, then you have some level of literacy, you have some level of command over modern standard Arabic, so at least you will be able to follow some of the material. In a sense, those who are able to read already have some command of modern standard Arabic because this comes with the territory. These tensions are characteristic of all areas of life, and they do have temporal dimensions as well. Since we're talking about time, this is important. So, for example, while the internet and social media have undoubtedly allowed communities of struggle across the world to connect and mobilize in unprecedented ways, their temporal logic also disrupts some of the core principles of global movements of action, such as basic principles such as participatory decision-making, for example, which requires longer and more flexible time windows. In part because activists are, of course, separated sometimes by up to 12 hours. If you're thinking of activists working in Australia and Burkina Faso, for instance, trying to communicate and reach a decision based on consensus, they need time. They need at least 12, 14 hours to get there. But obviously, the kind of participatory decision-making and reflection needs even longer in order to come to fruition. The temporal logic of social media and the internet therefore poses challenges to processes of deliberation and participation, even as these same platforms enable communities to connect in unprecedented ways. So, perhaps going back to Philip and Basma and their idea of using spoken varieties of Arabic and subtitling films, the tension may be partly resolved, only partly, can't be totally resolved. May be partly resolved by using a range of complementary strategies to respond to the complexities of the temporal moment. So in a related context, I critique the use of hegemonic English as lingua franca as a priority language for subtitling Arabic documentary films by these same groups, Muslimin, the groups I interviewed and worked with in Egypt. I criticize them for giving priority to English, which is the common lingua franca, as the default language into which all the videos had to be subtitled and circulated on the web, because I said that this is a practice that basically neglects the fact that solidarity is needed most urgently among communities that are struggling in places like Ethiopia and Kashmir and Sri Lanka, communities where very few people, if any, have extensive command of English. Even if they can speak a bit of English, they don't necessarily speak enough or understand enough to understand the nuances of the revolutionary context which these videos were presenting. Nevertheless, having criticized these groups for using English as the default lingua franca into which all the videos were being translated, I myself deliberately adopted English as the lingua franca, as the official language of an activist conference that I organized in Cairo in 2015, and which was attended by many members of the collectives I critiqued for privileging the same hegemonic language. It was also attended by Federico back then. And one of the positive outcomes of this case was that Turkish, Indian, and Taiwanese and other colleagues who attended the conference from all over the world went back to their communities and initiated and circulated a whole series of Mussolini videos subtitled into their languages. So that for the first time, we started getting subtitled Mussolini videos into Hindi, Urdu, Turkish, and so on. So you can critique a particular use of strategies, but in one context, and use it in another context, rather than say that the kind of tensions that are embedded in such contexts can be resolved by the use of one strategy consistently all the time. So there's no escape from these tensions and no escape from the realities of the moment. But we can reflect on them and vary our strategies depending on the pressures and opportunities of that moment. Whether we attend more to those present realities or to some utopian vision of a better future we want to bring into being now is probably the main difference between prefiguration and aspiration translation. Okay, we're okay so far. We'll move on to the next main issue, which is prefiguration and aspirational translation in the century with no future. I take the expression the century with no future from, as I said earlier, from Franco Berardi's volume After the Future. Berardi, also known as Beppo, and probably not many people here. I think he's from Bologna originally. Berardi uses the expression repeatedly throughout the volume, and in order to refer to the 21st century, not to the 20th century, to the 21st century that we're in now. He also associates this idea of a century with no future with modernity, and he defines moderns as those who live time as the sphere of progress towards perfection, or at least towards improvement, enrichment, and brightness. In the preface to the first English translation, to this English translation, of course, that I'm relying on of After the Future, the editors sum up the whole argument, because Berardi's argument is complex and it's not just restricted to the idea of this century having no future or no vision of a future we can be confident in and rely on. He talks about technology, he talks about the effect of technology on our brains, and that is part of the argument, so it's quite a complex, long argument. But the editors sum it up very nicely, the main point at least that is relevant to what I'm talking about today, and they say the analytic, psychological, and libidinal structures of 20th century revolutionary politics were beholden to the temporal form of the future. It even gave the name to the first movement of the futurism. The future was on the side of the revolution. It was a great and empowering myth, but few believe it any longer. The future is over. Interestingly, given that I'm working on the Genealogies of Knowledge Project now, we have a whole panel on it later, and it's co-sponsoring this conference. I thought perhaps I'll go to one of the corpora, electronic corpora that we're building for the project, which is a corpus made up of internet English, and which is a corpus that features a lot of radical material on both sides, left and right. And I thought, well, I'll have a quick look at the corpus and see if people talk about the future in such negative terms as well among radical groups today. And the most interesting thing I found, I mean, we can talk about that later, but that I actually found a reference directly to Beppo. This is the actually one line from the corpus that you can expand. You can talk about the Genealogies Project later, but for the purposes of this talk, I'll just read the relevant bit. In one of the radical outlets, the author says, for all its strategies and failures, at least the old left was once driven by hopes and visions of a better future. Today, all such aspirations seem to have been abandoned. As Franco, Beppo, Berardi has astutely put it, the future has been cancelled, and the left, unmoored from its post-capitalist imaginary, has been cast hopelessly adrift in the process. So this is a kind of view of how people orient themselves to the future, or at least how radical people and revolutionaries orient themselves to the future, that seems to be also recognized among a lot of groups that are writing radical articles today. At any rate, Berardi is not the only author who expresses this view of our current orientation to the future. Many authors from many different disciplines express similar views. So, for example, Laura Baer, among many others, also believes that, and I quote, "We live in a period in which futures have lost their utopian qualities." What does this mean in terms of activist translation strategies, and how does it relate to prefiguration and a potential definition of aspirational translation that might betray this or reflect this current experience or orientation towards the future? Now, prefiguration assumes that we can act on the future. And in fact, anyone, of course, not just activists, I mean, prefiguration is associated with activism, but the idea that you can do things now that can have an impact on the future is not restricted to prefiguration, because it's something that anybody can do. You can mobilize time politically in ways that you hope can have an impact on the future, and importantly, it's powerful institutions do this all the time. They do this in ways that affect us all. For example, in terms of adopting approaches that ensure that the future reasserts and reinforces the past, rather than imagining it in new ways or leaving the future open to wider possibilities. So, to give you an example, the official strategy of preemption, on which policies such as profiling are based, adopts an inherently conservative vision of the world by assuming that how a person has behaved in the past, or the kind of environment or locale that the person has been born into, will necessarily or can necessarily predict how this person will behave in the future. Preemption therefore reinforces established views of the world, projecting them into the future, and acts on this basis in the present in ways that ensure that that future is realized. It forecloses any alternative imaginings of the future. Prefiguration attempts exactly the opposite. It leaves the past behind, it looks forward towards the future, and acts in the present in ways that might realize a particular vision of this better future. It's the opposite of preemption. So, prefiguration is rooted in the present. We are all rooted in the present, whether we like it or not, that goes without saying. But it orients itself very much towards the future. It has little or no relationship with the past. It doesn't look to the past at all. In this sense, it reflects a kind of faith in the possibility of a brighter future, or the myth of the future, that Bifo attributes to the rise of modern capitalism, the expansion of the economy, and the scientific revolution, and that he associates very much with a modern narrative of progress. By the 20th century, this myth of a brighter future, according to Bifo, and the confidence that science in particular gave us in being able to control the future became, in Bifo's words, and I quote, a true faith based on the concept of progress, the ideological translation of the reality of economic growth. Bifo argues that all strands of modern political theory, importantly including anarchism, which he mentions specifically, to which prefiguration is usually attributed, and I quote him again, share a common certainty, notwithstanding the darkness of the present, the future will be bright. There are two reassuring qualities about this myth of a brighter future are the belief that we are able to know and predict the future, in part because science allows us to. Science is powerful and allows us to discover more laws of nature and develop the instruments for controlling it. And importantly, the belief that, and again I quote Bifo here, the future may be transformed by human will, by industry, economic technique, and political action. This confidence in our ability to have an impact on the future is clearly reflected, I would say, in the idea of prefiguration, the idea that we can intervene and make things better by acting now in particular ways. In this sense, in the sense of the future not as temporal unfolding or a direction of time, but as a psychological perception, Bifo insists that the future is over. He insists that it is over because in the sense of the bourgeois mythology of a linear development of welfare and democracy, the technocratic mythology of the all-encompassing power of scientific knowledge. He calls this century the century of the future, meaning that we know that the time after the present is going to come, but we don't expect that this time will fulfill the promises of the present. Now, if Biffo and many others are right, then prefiguration, I would say, loses at least some of its appeal with the collapse of the idea of a potentially better future and the confidence invested in believing that we can act on that future. The insecurity, precarity, and growing sense of a lack of control over our lives perhaps drives us more towards the past than to look to the future, making nostalgia a more attractive proposition possible. But it also leaves us preoccupied with surviving in the immediate present. The weight of the present overwhelms the imagination and leaves less room for thinking about the future. Instead of laying plans for the long-term future, we survive from day to day and focus on coping with the present. Though, of course, naturally, we continue to hope and dream. That is part of being human. We can't stop that. But hoping and dreaming is one thing, and believing that we can act on the future and shape it is quite different. And that it will be right is quite different. This also means that we have little, importantly, or indeed no time or even appetite for experimentation. Experimentation being a cornerstone of prefiguration. The whole idea of prefiguration is that we can experiment in the present in order to think of novel ways of creating or imagining the future. If the weight of the present is such that we are forced to invest all our energies into coping with it, then experimentation becomes a luxury we can ill afford. Now, moving on to aspirational translation, the strategies proposed by Sherif Gaber for aspirational translation and the way he talks about it most of the time reflect this new logic, this kind of lack of confidence in the future and this being overwhelmed by the present. Although, as I said, it's really very difficult to think about acting at all without expressing some hope in the future. It's a question of degree. Now, Gaber, as I mentioned earlier, is an urban planner who is keen to develop a terminology for talking about the city that is not simply imported from the north, but is rooted in the immediate realities of Egyptian cities. Realities which are far removed from those of New York, London, or Stockholm, or Paris. At first glance, the definition that he offers only in the last 2 paragraphs of the article makes aspirational translation sound pretty close to prefiguration. And since this is the closest we get to aspirational translation, this is the only article in which it's mentioned, it's worth quoting in full, the 2 full paragraphs. So he says, public spaces have been denigrated and excluded from our vocabularies. The issue here is thus one of aspirational terminology, perhaps of actively creating terminology to describe the spaces we desire, spaces we want to bring into existence. The creation of such an aspirational terminology will take as its starting point the everyday language of the streets, the language used to describe those streets, and would imbue it with both political potential and theoretical sophistication. And the final paragraph, even if the outcomes of a socially just city are the same in Chicago as they are in Cairo, the cities are vastly different, as are the tools and resources that are available to build more just cities. An aspirational language of the city recognizes this, and recognizes that local terms alone are not sufficient, but their deployment is a necessary condition for helping to kindle the imagination and create possible spaces within the existing city. Uncovering and developing new terms for the Egyptian city, or any city, is in this sense a process of uncovering the mechanisms and tools that can create leverage to change the city. So he's still talking about possible change, but not in such confident terms. And then there is also the rest of the article in which the extended discussion leading to these 2 paragraphs of the paper suggests that aspirational translation in practice is not only firmly rooted in the present, as we all are, and to some extent looks towards the past for inspiration, but it is importantly overwhelmed by the present. So Gaber says, in a city which in the last 50 years at most has seen a radical transformation of its very nature, not to mention an explosion in built area and population, it is clear that the compressed present holds overwhelming sway over the city. So it's the idea of the present being so challenging, so immediate and oppressive that it's very difficult to attend to the future more than we attend to the present. And indeed, the example he gives for the kind of terminology he believes should be adopted. Should I stop opinion? Yeah. The kind of terminology that he believes should be adopted make it clear that his attention is really totally on the present realities and on reaching out to people embedded in those realities in order to empower. Not through any form of experimentation. Experimentation does not come into it at all, but merely by working with them to develop a shared language with which to talk about the realities in an idiom that they recognize and can relate to. So aspirational translation highlights the importance of reconnecting with the lived experience of people. In this case, people locked in concrete urban spaces who struggle just to survive from day to day and definitely have no time to experiment. In terms of its relationship to the past, although Gaber claims that he would not attempt to suggest using terms from the distant past, both because he doesn't have the expertise required to uncover such terms and because the city has changed so radically that it bears little relationship to its medieval past, he does repeatedly invoke the past, perhaps the less distant past, but all the same, he does invoke the past. For instance, in outlining the main issue in the abstract of the article, he points out that Arabic terms often have no ready equivalents in English, of course. These terms have older histories and roots within Egyptian culture, he says, and many are now attempting to deploy them to advance contemporary social justice and demands. So he does actually refer to other activists deploying terms from the past as one strategy of what he would call aspirational translation. The past remains relevant. Okay, the past remains a resource. He also gives a concrete example himself of going back to classical Arabic for alternatives to the term urban. The term urban, of course, which comes from English, imported from the north, reflects the town-country split that is very common in Europe, but not in places like Egypt. So Gaber suggests that translating a word like urban by a word like omran in Arabic would be more successful because omran is closer to the idea of a built environment, which encompasses not just urban areas but other areas of human settlement, including rural areas. And the term originates from Ibn Khaldun, from his Prolegomena, which contrasts the built environment with unsettled areas and deserts. So he does go back to the past to try and uncover some terms that would be meaningful in the present and reflect that reality better. So he argues that recovering these classical words and deploying them in critical and professional contexts allows us to reconfigure the analytic units used to describe the city and its social formations. It allows us to develop alternative configurations to those that derive from northern histories of property and urbanism. Just check the time. Okay, Gaber talks about the need for a new language to document new phenomena as well as advocate for change, but not a language or practices to anticipate the future or bring it into being. So aspirational translation doesn't disregard the past. The past is important and is a source of inspiration. It doesn't rule out potential change in the future, but it doesn't orient itself to the future and doesn't exude confidence in the future in the way that prefiguration does. Trying to 5 minutes, okay. So Gaber sees the development of a new language as necessary to resist the language of the state, the government, which is very oppressive and powerful in the region, and which continues to assert itself and its grip on spaces by using its own language and the legal system to refer to the spaces that people inhabit in ways that suit those in power. So, for instance, he refers to competing with the language of the state and uses the example of the term Aradik Dawla, literally translates as states lands, which is widely used in Egypt, and says that this designates public utilities and infrastructure, including streets and sidewalks, as military installations, with transgressions against them carrying the threat of military trial, so that public spaces are themselves considered facilities and installations, not public space, much less spaces of sociability, interaction, or community. Here, the words used by the state to describe what we might see as public space are already incorporated into a security strategic language. So we need to compete with that language by reactivating language sometimes from the past that can relate more to how people want to experience their environment. Reviving the language from the past to describe the realities of the present would, in this sense, then compete with the official language and assist in advocating for change. Not necessarily in creating facts on the ground as prefiguration would set out to do, but simply competing in the context of the present reality. The terminological dilemmas that Gaber struggles with are not, importantly, are not abstract and don't concern linguistic accuracy or elegance. This is not what aspirational translation is about. The idea of aspirational translation relates to developing a critical terminology which can support effective advocacy for social justice in the city. Gaber and many urban specialists in the region attempt to find words which can rehabilitate concepts such as public space in Arabic, ways that are first comprehensive to people in the street and resonate with their own lived experience of the city, and secondly, can be used to create a shared language across the region to assist with the work of advocacy. Aspirational translation, as envisaged by Gaber, is rooted in the local and privileges the lived experience of lay people, not only to be able to converse and work with these lay people on critical urban projects, but because the terms used by lay people who live in the kind of neighborhoods that Gaber and other activists target embody a communitarian ethos that is missing from the important vocabulary of Western urban scholarship. Gaber argues that by focusing on the space generated by the languages of their fellow citizens, professionals and activists can direct their efforts towards enhancing those issues that people most care about and creating change not in abstract sites unconnected to lived experience, but in the concrete divisions and phenomena that people nakedly perceive as they experience the city. It is in this sense that aspirational translation privileges the present above all, much more than the past and the future. And it is in this sense, too, that it perhaps reflects the waning of the myth of a brighter future and the confidence that we can bring that utopian future into being by experimenting with novel and utopian ways of being together in the present. The present is too present, too challenging to ignore, and the confidence in our ability to change the future has been dealt many serious blows in the last few decades, so that the luxury of experimentation is simply not available to many people anymore. And finally, and I'm still not advocating for aspirational translation as opposed to prefiguration, I'm saying kind of what kinds of things both reflect. Finally, from the point of view of those of us interested in issues of language and translation, what is particularly attractive about aspirational translation, and the reason I think we should engage more with it and maybe try to develop definitions of it that haven't been offered by people outside translation studies, specifically Sherif Gaber. What is particularly attractive about aspirational translation is that, unlike prefiguration, it directly addresses textual and translational strategies, whereas prefiguration was never conceptualized with semiotic processes these are kind of really just kind of raw comments to see how our ideas about strategies like prefiguration and aspirational translation, and maybe there are other strategies that we can talk about, ultimately simply reflect the feeling of a generation, the way we are oriented towards big time spans collectively, although individuals with individual attitudes could vary within this kind of collective feeling of the moment. And depending on how we want to orient ourselves to these time spans, we may find one strategy more attractive or more effective in one context than another. And I'll leave you with some, the references I mentioned. Of course, there are many other references you can draw.
Thank you, Mona, for this very inspiring and, should I say, aspirational talk. And should there be questions, we have 5-10 minutes, so it's time for questions from the audience.
Thank you, Mona. It was a fantastic talk. I was interested in one point that you have mentioned at the very end, where Gabe makes this point about developing new conceptual systems that can allow you to discuss topics with the general citizen, let's say.
Yeah.
I'm interested in that point because I'm sure you will agree that activism very often tends to rely on a set of concepts that can be very far off, very distant from general citizens, which might not be at all familiar with these concepts and feel stranded. So, to what extent in your research and what you're doing, do you see that these efforts are successful, or are they borne in mind, this idea of developing new concepts that can actually resonate with, let's say, non-specialists?
Yeah, I think my immediate experience, of course, is of Egypt and working with Egyptian activists, and I would say that this is pretty much taken as the norm among activists, many of whom are intellectuals, and the ones I talk to at least, and can reflect on these things quite easily, but there is a shift in the way that they orient themselves to lay people, which, given my age and kind of, I've seen many movements over the years and was involved in movements myself in the 70s, and I remember very clearly that in the 70s, we students thought that we were the educated people. We knew what's best for everybody, and we weren't learning anything from other people. We just knew, and they should learn from us. We were the educated. I've never talked to people outside the campus, essentially. Whereas today, what's happening with the Egyptian revolution, even though it is often presented as the revolution of the kind of social media revolution and the revolution that's led by intellectuals, that's not the case, actually. People who died on the streets were mostly uneducated people. And the activists, the intellectuals, the filmmakers and so on, who work with, in terms of trying to effect change, they're very much more humble than we used to be, much more modest than we used to be. And they constantly talk about learning from people on the ground. And they are very clear that they understand that they are in a very privileged position and that their experience of the world doesn't reflect the realities of the ground. So in that sense, there is, I would think, a much more honest and sustained attempt to not just engage with lay people, but to learn from them, because they know better. The other thing that I would say is that on the basis of a recent conversation I had in Cairo with Philip Riz and Basma, actually, after I did that interview with them, they know that I published on the interviews that I did with them. They don't care, they're not interested in reading this material, really. And when I mentioned prefiguration, even though they really do talk about non-hierarchy, they practice non-hierarchical structures, they talk about all the right things. They have never heard of prefiguration. They didn't know what that is or what it means. So yeah, there is that disconnect, but it's less than it used to be, and it's going in the right direction, I would say.
Hello. My question is about climate change and the Anthropocene. So, distance to the microphone. So yeah, my question is about climate change in the Anthropocene and how the current situation with climate change and biodiversity loss is affecting ideas of the future, and how this is kind of being translated and being disseminated through activist networks. And what sort of evidence are you seeing of that, and how people are conceptualizing what they're doing?
Again, like everybody else, my experience is limited to the context I move in and the people I talk to, and so it's pretty limited to Egypt really, apart from the intellectual stuff we hear in conferences all of us about other contexts. And climate change is an urgent issue in Egypt, but again, because people are so overwhelmed by realities, and reality is kind of quite harsh, climate change is only one of many, many things that they talk about, and it's not the priority at the moment, because if you are trying to do something about people being disappeared, you know, lots of people being disappeared the way they were disappeared in Argentina many years ago, and people being tortured on a daily basis, in horrible ways of torture and so on. This seems much more urgent than climate change, even though you're aware that, you know, there's very serious pollution and you need to do something about it. It's a question of priorities really, and responding to the most urgent challenges. So it is an issue, but not one that I've heard activists talk about too much or concentrate their efforts on. It's almost, if you see it from that perspective and compare the different contexts, it's almost a luxury topic. You know, if you're worried about climate change and pollution, then at least you are in a position to breathe and live and think about long term, not just respond to being tortured or disappeared or looking, you know, getting the body of a friend or a member of the family out of the morgue because the state won't give you the body after they've killed him or her, because that would be evidence used against them. And so, you know, that kind of concrete, everyday, challenging stuff that doesn't give you time to think about the long-term issues. So it's an issue, they're aware of it, but it's not part of it.
Thank you very much for this wonderful presentation, Mona. My name is Nicole Dörr from the University of Copenhagen. This is very powerful. You're both going beyond your previous work and connecting this to one of the most urgent questions of today. And my one question to you is, so I'm trying to think it through from one of the people who comes from social movement studies, where really this term prefiguration doesn't make sense to a lot of activists. In different countries, it's an academic term, but it's also, there is some new interesting work by some colleagues who connected to the politics of hope.
Yes.
So, yeah, and that's where you're going. So, very exciting. The power, what's the power of aspirational translation? Or, like, when we change the words, the terms, we bring up, Sherif Geber, rights and things, concepts that have been forgotten, we reinvent in the future. How will change then happen? So I'm already getting to the next step. Is it, we have to change how can we have the diffusion of new concepts? There are sometimes in time moments when from one moment to the other, collective thinking changes.
Yes.
These are thought revolutions.
Yes.
Like the Reformation was one. I don't know
the what?
The Christian Reformation. But so
is it, how can we enact change? And my personal research is on solidarity between refugees and citizens, and questions of solidarity. And so can aspirational translation as a practice also change the various boundaries between people? Like, can it serve as an egalitarian mode of communicating within a coalition?
Yeah.
What would be the conditions?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the attractions of aspirational translation is precisely that it doesn't have a set definition that restricts you. There is a potential there for working with or developing definitions that kind of arise from the bottom up rather than from the intellectual side down, as it were. You can define it, you know, we can think of different ways of defining it, but where it would probably be most productive in the kind of context you're talking about is in the fact that it does attend very much to the present moment, to the realities of the present moment, and to the lived experience of people. And that is a good starting point for change, because if you don't attend to that, and if you don't understand that, and if you don't empower people to talk in their own idiom about the issues they want to talk about, then you're not going to go very far anyway. So that's a starting point. But there is no set definition, as I said. You know, I think if I brought Sharif Gaber here today and asked him to define it, he would be at a loss as well. You know, he just talked about it without thinking through too much what the implications are, but gave enough. It was a programmatic article, if you like, gave enough of kind of a feeling for what it might involve to allow us to maybe develop ourselves in product.
Okay, there's time for one last question.
Good morning. Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. I do not come from academic circles. I come from a translation service or a public service from the European Parliament. And in the public services, we talk a lot about citizens' language, especially in the European Parliament, where we have 24 languages, and I will be presenting about the citizens' language this afternoon. And one of our key direction there is plain language or clear language, or as we call it, the citizens' language. And we're trying to create our translations according to these principles. Of course, we are all enthused and enthusiastic about it. But do you see any dangers or any disadvantages in clear language?
Everything has disadvantages. Nothing is kind of 100% advantageous. But I mean, the project of clear or plain language has been going on for a long time in the EU, and initiated by the translators themselves, who think that EU officials speak weird language that nobody else can understand, so they try through translation to make that more accessible to ordinary citizens. I think that's a very good aim. Whether it has this, I mean, there is a disconnect here, because you're talking about an initiative which is institutionally driven, and institutions have their own objectives, and you can ask, why do they want to communicate with citizens in a language that citizens can understand? It's not just a question of clear language. Where is this going? What are they trying to achieve? Which are usually aims that are quite different from activist aims in a way. So it depends. I mean, you can also use very clear language to really mislead people. I mean, you know, in fact, if you want to mislead people, you have to use clear language. Otherwise, they won't be misled. So you have to think through, you know, what are the objectives, and rather than whether it's clear language or very officialese. I'm sorry, it's not quite my area, so I'm not sure that the answer was relevant.
Okay, any other urgent questions, very quick ones, over time?
Thank you, Professor Baker, for your excellent presentation. My name is Igor Tesh. I'm from different background. I'm a translation historian, but I've been working with the work of Steve Pinker recently because I've translated Enlightenment Now, which is this huge book of his, and I subscribe to his, I see his vision of the present as full of potential based on empirical data and so on. How do you, based on what you told us, how do you see the potential of the present and its potential to change, but also the potential that it holds today? Thank you.
That's a very difficult question. I understand that Steven Pinker probably argues the exact opposite of Franco Berardi. So we're talking about very different attitudes to time. I mean, obviously the present always has potential, lots of potential, otherwise we might as well just go home and sleep. But it's a question really of whether you think that potential has a chance, which of these potentials has a chance of surviving. And at the moment, my view is rather bleak, like Berardi, that because of advances in technology specifically, there is a sense in which the powerful institutions are able to just continue to gain more power much more rapidly than we can fight them, because the technology allows them to. It's not just surveillance technology, for instance, but the kind of technology that invades your cognitive mechanisms and actually shapes the way you think. And so it's looking bleak. I don't know how, we need a huge, maybe catastrophe to take us back to a point where we can envisage a bit more control over both our present and future. So I'm not terribly optimistic, but that doesn't mean that that's the way other people think in my generation. I suppose it's partly to do with your experience of life and what your own position in society or in a particular society allows you, what potential it allows you to see and where to go. And whether, of course, even if you are in a position that allows you to envisage a lot of good coming, a better future, brighter future, you are still able to understand and empathize with lots of others who don't have these options. And one of the very interesting things that Berardi argues in After the Future is that because of the way in which this new technology, digital technology, invades our cognitive mechanisms and the way we are increasingly being socialized into using emojis and short text and all that kind of stuff, our very ability to empathize is being affected, and that it's even when you see a lot of tragedy on the telly, it's just spectacle, and you are less able to empathize with that experiences. It's not much of an answer. It's a difficult question.
Thank you very much. I think now we move on to coffee break, and if you want to ask a question, it would be way back and then. Thank you very much.